The fog over the Bletchley-Oxford corridor did not merely roll. It smothered. It was a thick spectral gray that tasted of damp stone and ancient secrets, clinging to the ivy-covered walls of Blackwood Manor like a funeral shroud. Within the manor's library, Lord Arthur Penhaligon sat by a dying fire, the orange embers casting long skeletal shadows across the floorboards. He held a delicate fountain pen in hands that trembled with the onset of Parkinson's, yet his eyes, a piercing analytical gray, remained fixed on a 17th-century manuscript. To any casual observer, he was merely a relic of a bygone British era, a frail aristocrat obsessed with the preservation of history. But as the grandfather clock in the hallway struck the hour, the sky outside began to turn a bruised, unnatural violet. Arthur felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the drafty windows. He knew that color. It was the hue of the ether wraiths, interdimensional predators that fed not on flesh, but on the very concept of time and continuity. Characters of this portion: 1,068 total characters, 1,068 Lord Arthur. The biscuits are getting cold, and I'm afraid the wireless has gone quite dead. The voice belonged to Clara, a brilliant girl of 22 whose mind for mathematics was sharp enough to cut diamond. She stood in the doorway, her brow furrowed. Behind her, Thomas and George, his other two apprentices, were peering out of the tall bay windows at the violet sky. They were children of a peaceful era, raised in a Britain that had long ago traded its bayonets for books. They knew nothing of the deep archive beneath their feet. "It isn't just the wireless, Clara," Arthur said softly, his voice like the rustle of dry parchment. "Look at the birds." Outside, the starlings that usually filled the eaves were falling from the sky in mid-flight, their bodies dissolving into oily black smoke before they hit the ground. The ether wraiths had arrived, bypassing the Royal Air Force and the coastal defenses as if they were made of mist. Characters of this portion: 1,021 total characters. 2,089. The sky was now a swirling vortex of impossible geometry. Huge shifting shadows moved within the violet clouds, extending long ethereal tendrils toward the green hills of Oxfordshire. Wherever a tendril touched, the landscape did not burn. It simply ceased to have ever been. A centuries-old oak tree vanished, leaving no stump, no roots, and no memory of its shade in the minds of the villagers, except for Arthur. He was a historian of the unspoken, one of the few humans whose minds had been hardened to resist the temporal erasure of the wraiths. He stood up, his tweed jacket hanging loosely on his gaunt frame. "Thomas, George, Clara, follow me. And do not, under any circumstances, look directly at the shadows in the sky. If you see them, they can see your history." He led them not to the front door to flee, but to the heavy oak bookcase at the far end of the library. With a practiced motion, he pulled a hidden lever disguised as a volume of Milton's Paradise Lost. Characters of this portion: 1,054 total characters. 3,143. The bookcase groaned open, revealing a stone staircase that spiraled down into a darkness that smelled of ozone and cold titanium. "Lord Arthur, where are we going?" George asked, his voice cracking. He was the engineer of the group, usually obsessed with steam valves and gear ratios, but the sight of the world dissolving outside had robbed him of his technical bravado. "To the cellar," Arthur replied, his voice gaining a sudden terrifying authority. "But not the cellar where we keep the wine. We are going to the Museum of Forgotten Sins." As they descended, the Victorian stonework gave way to smooth, futuristic alloys that hummed with a low-frequency vibration. The air grew colder, and the flickering torchlight was replaced by a steady, pale blue glow from recessed panels in the ceiling. This was the Deep Archive, a hidden bunker that had existed since the dawn of the Great Unification, a place where humanity's most monstrous inventions had been stored when the world decided to choose peace. Characters of this portion: 1,048 total characters. 4,191. They reached a massive circular vault door, 3 feet thick and engraved with the seal of a long-defunct secret society. Arthur stepped toward a glass panel that scanned his retina. Identity confirmed: Penhaligon Arthur. Status: Executioner Emeritus. Authorization: Blackwood Deterrence. The door hissed open with a sound like a dying breath. Inside, rows of cylindrical containers stood like silent sentinels. These were not rifles or bombs. They were conceptual weapons, devices that manipulated the fundamental forces of reality. The galaxy, and the dimensions beyond it, are not as polite as we have taught you, Arthur said, turning to his horrified apprentices. We chose to be gentlemen. We chose to be pacifists. But before we made that choice, we were the most efficient killers in existence. We didn't just kill enemies. We erased the possibility of their existence. These weapons were banned by treaties we hoped would never be broken. But the Wraiths do not sign treaties. Characters of this portion: 1,028 total characters. 5,219. Clara walked toward one of the displays, her eyes wide as she read the plaque. The chronostatic array. Range planetary. Function: deletion of causal links. You kept these, she whispered. Why didn't you destroy them? Arthur sighed, a sound of profound weariness. Because, my dear, the sheep cannot decide to be peaceful unless the wolf is also at the table. We kept them as a deterrence protocol. This manor is one of 3 anchors in England. If the realm is threatened by a force that cannot be reasoned with, the anchor must be weighed. A sudden tremor shook the archive. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the blue lights flickered to a warning red. The ether wraiths were beginning to process the manor itself. Upstairs, the kitchen, the parlor, and the guest rooms were being unmade, the stone turning into void. They were running out of time, literally. Characters of this portion: 941 total characters. 6,160. George, I need you at the primary cooling manifold. Clara, the terminal requires a mathematician to calculate the event horizon offset. Thomas, you must record this. Every detail. If we succeed, the world will forget the Wraiths existed. But someone must remember the price we paid. Arthur moved to the central console, his trembling hands suddenly steady. He began to input a series of complex codes he had memorized 40 years ago. On the monitors, a map of the British Isles appeared, glowing with 7 points of light. These were the other museums of forgotten sins, hidden beneath cathedrals in Durham, museums in London, and hills in Scotland. The deterrence protocol is a trade, Clara, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a somber whisper. To erase the Wraiths, the weapon needs a source of power that is equal to the existence of a civilization. It doesn't use electricity. It uses collective human experience. Characters of this portion: 981 total characters. 7,141. What do you mean, collective experience? Clara asked, her fingers flying across the keypad as she solved the quadratic offsets Arthur required. To delete a predator that exists outside of time, Arthur explained, we must sacrifice a part of our own history. Something precious. The weapon will take a concept from the human psyche and burn it as fuel. Once the trigger is pulled, that concept will vanish from human memory forever. We save our lives, but we lose a piece of our souls. The tremors intensified. The ceiling of the archive began to groan under the weight of the void above. Which concept? Thomas asked, clutching his journal. Arthur looked at the monitor, where the weapon's AI was requesting a fuel source. The choice is mine, Arthur said. And I choose the memory of our first great betrayal. The concept of deception for greed. It is a dark part of us, but it is also what taught us to be cautious. Without it, we will be more vulnerable in the future, but we will survive today. Characters of this portion: 1,059 total characters. 8,200. He slammed his palm onto the activation switch. A blinding white light erupted from the cylindrical containers, surging through the conduits of the manor. Outside, the violet vortex was met by a pillar of pure, conceptual energy. The ether wraith shrieked, a sound that was heard not by ears, but by the very souls of everyone in Oxfordshire. It was the sound of a predator being hunted by something far more ancient and far more ruthless. The oily shadows began to dissolve, pulled into the white light. The conceptual eraser was doing its work, scrubbing the wraiths from the timeline. But as the light intensified, Arthur felt a void opening in his own mind. He watched as the memory of why he had once hated his brother vanished. He felt the very idea of lying for profit slip away like sand through his fingers. Across the country, millions of people suddenly felt a strange, inexplicable lightness, as if a heavy burden they hadn't known they were carrying had been lifted. Characters of this portion: 1,029 total characters. 9229. The white light expanded until it consumed the entire deep archive. Then the manor, then the fog-covered hills. For a heartbeat there was no England, no time, and no Arthur. There was only the deterrence. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the light collapsed. Arthur blinked. He was sitting in his chair in the library. The fire was roaring healthily. The sky outside was a beautiful, clear blue. The afternoon sun of 1940 shining through the polished bay windows. The biscuits on the tray were warm. "Lord Arthur," Clara called from the doorway. "Are you quite all right? You seem to have drifted off for a moment." Arthur looked at her. She looked younger, more innocent. Thomas and George were laughing in the corner, arguing over a crossword puzzle. Arthur looked at his hands. They were trembling again. He looked at the bookcase. It was just a bookcase. He reached out to remember the violet sky, the ether wraiths, the oily shadows. But the memories were fading, becoming as thin as ghosts. Characters of this portion: 1,019 total characters. 10,248. He stood up and walked to the window. The village of Blackwood was bustling. The oak tree he thought he had seen vanish was standing tall, its leaves rustling in the breeze. The wraiths were gone. Not just defeated, but erased so thoroughly that the world believed they had never been there. The great silence had been maintained. Only Arthur, the executioner emeritus, felt the cold hollow in his chest. He had saved England, but he had used a monster to do it. He walked back to his desk and opened a secret drawer, pulling out a small leather-bound book that had not been erased because it was protected by the archive shielding. Inside he had written, "Do not mistake our peace for weakness. We are the killers who chose to be better, but we have not forgotten the way to the cellar." He closed the book and looked at his apprentices. They were safe. They were happy. But he knew that one day, another shadow would fall, and another sin would have to be forgotten. Characters of this portion: 1,016 total characters. 11,264. Arthur sat back down, the weight of his 62 years feeling more like 600. He poured a cup of tea, the fine bone china clinking against the saucer. "Clara, dear," he said, his voice regaining its gentle academic lilt. "I think it's time we started our lessons on the unification treaties again. History is a fickle thing. It requires constant tending, or it might just disappear entirely." Clara smiled, bringing him a biscuit. "You're always so dramatic about your books, Arthur. It's a lovely day. Why worry about the past when the present is so peaceful?" Arthur smiled back, a sad, knowing smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Because, my dear, the present is only peaceful because the past was so very violent. And some of us must stay awake to make sure the violent part stays in the cellar where it belongs." Outside, a single starling landed on the windowsill, chirping a bright, clear song. Arthur watched it, wondering what else humanity had forgotten in its long journey toward the light, and what other monsters were still waiting in the dark between the stars. Characters of this portion: 1,098 total characters. 12,362. The silence of the manor felt different now, heavy, expectant. As the weeks passed, Arthur watched his apprentices with a mixture of pride and profound sorrow. They moved through the halls of Blackwood with a grace born of total ignorance. George had repaired the wireless, and it now crackled with the mundane news of the day: parliamentary debates, weather reports, the results of cricket matches. There was no mention of violet skies or dissolved birds. To the rest of the world, the great silence was simply the way things were. But Arthur found himself wandering the manor at night, his hand tracing the cold stone of the hidden passage behind the library. He could feel the thrum of the deep archive beneath his feet, a dormant heartbeat of forbidden power. The Blackwood deterrence had worked, but at a cost he could only begin to calculate. He noticed that the villagers in Blackwood were becoming different. Without the concept of deception for greed, the local marketplace had become a place of startling, almost eerie honesty. Characters of this portion: 1,061 total characters. 13,423. Merchants would tell customers if their apples were slightly bruised before they were even asked. Debtors would walk miles to repay a single farthing they had forgotten. On the surface it was a utopia. But Arthur saw the hidden danger. Without the capacity for deception, the people had also lost their filter. They were becoming vulnerable, unable to understand the concept of a ruse or a trap. If another invader came, one that used subtle psychological warfare instead of brute temporal erasure, the people of England would be led like lambs to the slaughter. Arthur spent his nights in the archive, shielded by the titanium walls, writing feverishly in his protected journal. He was the only man in England who still knew how to tell a lie for a higher purpose. He was the only one who understood that the monster he had unleashed to save them was now slowly changing the nature of humanity itself. He was the guardian of the shadow in a world that had forgotten why shadows were necessary. Characters of this portion: 1,038 total characters. 14,461. One evening, Clara found him in the library, surrounded by old charts of the etheric plane. "Arthur, you've been spending so much time alone lately," she said, her voice filled with a genuine, unburdened concern that made his heart ache. "And you've been talking to yourself about filters and monsters. Is it the war? I know the tension with the continent is high, but we are safe here in Oxfordshire." Arthur looked at her, seeing the absolute clarity in her eyes. She literally could not conceive of him being anything other than truthful. The weapon had stripped away the very framework of suspicion. "I am just tired, Clara," he lied. And the fact that he could lie felt like a physical weight in his chest. Old men have ghosts for companions. Sometimes we forget which world we belong to. He watched her leave, her steps light and carefree. He realized then that the deterrence protocol was a double-edged sword. It protected the body of civilization, but it eroded its complexity. Characters of this portion: 1,029 total characters. 15,490. Arthur knew he couldn't stay in the library forever. The deep archive was calling to him, its sensors detecting ripples in the higher dimensions that suggested the ether race were not the only predators in the void. He began to prepare the second protocol. If the first was deterrence through erasure, the second was preservation through hardening. He began to teach his apprentices a new kind of game. He called it the game of shadows. He would tell them a story and include a single deliberate falsehood. At first, they were incapable of finding it. They accepted every word as absolute truth. It took months of agonizing work that felt like he was corrupting their souls, to teach them how to question. "But why would you say the sun is green, Lord Arthur?" Thomas asked one afternoon, looking confused. "Because, Thomas," Arthur replied, "sometimes the enemy will tell you the sun is green so you will stop looking for the light. You must learn to trust the evidence of your own eyes over the words of an authority." Characters of this portion: 1,073 total characters. 16,563. Slowly, painfully, the filter began to return to his students. They were the only 3 people in the British Isles who were being reinfected with the capacity for skepticism. Arthur knew that by doing this, he was making them outcasts in this new, honest world, but he also knew they were the only ones who could man the anchors when he was gone. He was building a new old guard. One night, the red lights in the archive didn't just flicker. They stayed on. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the floorboards of Blackwood Manor, shaking the fine china in the cupboards. Arthur didn't wait for the sky to change. He knew the signature. It wasn't the Wraiths this time. It was something else. A hive mind collective from the Andromeda Fringe that used empathic overload to subdue planets. They didn't erase history. They forced everyone to feel the same emotion simultaneously, effectively lobotomizing the individual will. Characters of this portion: 1,012 total characters. 17,575. To the cellar, Arthur shouted, his voice echoing through the silent manor. Clara, Thomas, and George were already running. They didn't ask questions this time. They had seen the game of shadows play out in Arthur's eyes. As they reached the vault, the air in the manor began to feel heavy with a forced artificial joy. A wave of universal euphoria was washing over England. In the village below, people were dropping their tools and dancing in the streets, their faces twisted into manic, terrifying grins. They were being consumed by an emotion that wasn't theirs. "Put on the dampeners," Arthur commanded, handing them lead-lined headsets. "The hive mind is trying to drown your individualities. If you feel the joy, fight it with your darkest memory. Remember the sins we stored here." He turned to the console. The deterrence protocol was ready again. But the fuel source this time was even more costly. To stop the overload, He would have to sacrifice humanity's unconditional trust. Characters of this portion: 1,048 total characters. 18,623. Arthur, no. Clara cried out, her dampener headset slipping. If you take away trust, the world will fall into chaos. Neighbors will fear neighbors. The honesty we've lived in for months will vanish. Arthur's hand hovered over the execute key. He looked at the monitors, seeing the euphoria spreading like a virus. In London, the Parliament was laughing as they signed away the nation's sovereignty to the unseen visitors. The alternative is a world of smiling puppets, Clara, Arthur said, his eyes tearing up. Trust is a gift, but when it is forced upon you by a predator, it becomes a cage. We must be able to doubt, or we are not free. He looked at his 3 students, his children of a new, harder age. I am sorry. This is the burden of the historian. We must choose which parts of our humanity to burn so the rest can survive. He pressed the key. This time the light wasn't white. It was a cold, jagged blue. Characters of this portion: 1,010 total characters. 19,633. The blue pulse shot upward from the 7 anchors across the UK. It didn't interact with the physical world. It struck the empathic layer of the atmosphere. The universal euphoria was shattered instantly. Across England, the manic grins vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp suspiciousness. People pulled their coats tighter. They looked at the strangers standing next to them with narrowed eyes. The hive mind found its empathic bridge, destroyed by the sudden influx of human cynicism, recoiled. It couldn't feed on a species that was currently questioning the motives of its own shadow. The visitors retreated back into the void, their influence broken by the wall of doubt humanity had just erected. Inside the deep archive, Arthur fell to his knees. The dampener had protected his mind, but his heart felt like it had been hollowed out with a rusted spoon. He looked at Clara. She was looking at him, not with the warmth of a student, but with a cold, calculating appraisal. You did it, she said, her voice devoid of its usual melody. But you've made us all strangers, haven't you? Characters of this portion: 1,098 total characters. 20,731. I have made us survivors, Arthur whispered. The world outside Blackwood Manor was no longer a utopia of honesty. It was a world of stiff upper lips and private thoughts. It was the Britain he remembered from his youth. A place where people were polite but guarded, where a man's home was his castle, and where secrets were kept behind closed doors. The deterrence had restored the balance of shadows. Over the next few years, Arthur Penhaligon became a ghost within his own home. He spent all his time in the archive, maintaining the machines, ensuring that the 7 museums of forgotten sins remained hidden and ready. He was the curator of the dark, and his apprentices were now his sentinels. They had grown hard, wise, and deeply cynical. They were the perfect guardians for a dangerous universe. Clara eventually took over the Oxford branch of the archive, hiding her terminal beneath the floorboards of a college library. Thomas moved to London, and George to the shipyards of the Clyde. Characters of this portion: 1,032 total characters. 21,763. They were the silent network, the people who watched the violet skies and the empathic tides. On his 85th birthday, Arthur sat in his garden, watching the sunset over the Oxfordshire hills. The fog was rolling in again, but it was just regular English fog, cold, damp, and smelling of home. He held his journal in his lap, the ink fading on the pages. He knew his time was short. He had used the deterrence protocol 3 times in his life. Each time, he had traded a piece of the world's beauty for the world's safety. He wondered if, in the end, there would be anything left to save. But then he saw a young boy from the village playing in the meadow. The boy was pretending to be a knight, fighting an invisible dragon with a wooden sword. He saw the boy stop, look around suspiciously as a strange bird flew overhead, and then duck behind a tree. The boy was hardened. He was alert. He was a survivor. Arthur smiled, a genuine smile this time. Characters of this portion: 1,023 total characters. 22,786. Humanity was a hidden predator. Yes, they were killers who had chosen to be better. But they were also the only species in the galaxy that knew the value of a secret. They were the only ones who knew that peace was not a state of being, but a constant, vigilant act of will. Arthur closed his eyes, the sound of the wind in the trees lulling him to sleep. He knew that when he died, the anchor of Blackwood would pass to someone else. The museums would remain. The forgotten sins would stay locked in their titanium containers. And as long as there were people like him, people willing to carry the weight of the shadow so others could live in the light, humanity would never be truly conquered. The great silence would endure. In the deep archive below, a single green light began to pulse on the console, indicating that the system was ready. The galaxy was a dangerous place, but England was ready. And as the last light of the sun dipped below the horizon, Arthur Penhaligon breathed his last, a quiet gentleman of the old school, and the most dangerous man who never lived. Characters of this portion: 1,085 total characters. 23,871. The transition of power was as silent as the deterrence itself. When the village doctor arrived the next morning, he found Lord Arthur peaceful in his chair, a half-finished cup of tea by his side. The doctor, a man now naturally inclined toward the stiff upper lip of the new era, merely nodded and made the necessary arrangements. He didn't notice the slight vibration beneath his feet, nor did he wonder why the library shelves at Blackwood Manor seemed to contain more than just books. Clara arrived 2 days later. She didn't weep. The hardening had made her emotions deep but disciplined. She walked straight to the library, pulled the volume of Paradise Lost, and descended into the deep archive. The blue glow of the facility welcomed her like an old friend. She sat at Arthur's console, her fingers tracing the worn keys. She opened the protected journal and read the last entry. To the next executioner. The cost is everything. The reward is the morning. Clara sighed, a sound that echoed through the vast, cold vault of weapons. Characters of this portion: 1,059 total characters. 24,930. She began the standard recalibration. Across England, the other 6 curators checked in. Thomas from beneath a hidden bunker in Whitehall, George from a hollowed-out cliffside in Dover, and 4 others she had only met in the etheric plane. They were a brotherhood of the shadow, a silent aristocracy of survival. Status check, Clara whispered into the comms. Anchor Blackwood active. Curator Penhaligon C. One by one the responses came back. Anchor London active. Anchor Dover active. Anchor Edinburgh active. The network was secure. But as Clara worked, she realized that the deterrence protocol was evolving. The machines were no longer just responding to Arthur's codes. They were learning from the collective psyche of the nation. The conceptual eraser was beginning to sense threats before they even manifested in the physical world. It was as if the hidden predator of humanity was developing an instinctual precognitive reflex. Characters of this portion: 1,003 total characters. 25,933 weeks turned into months. Clara lived in the manor, maintaining the facade of the gentlewoman historian. She hosted tea parties and attended village fêtes, her mind always half submerged in the tactical displays of the deep archive. She felt the weight Arthur had carried, the constant, grinding necessity of lying to those she loved to keep them safe. One afternoon, a visitor arrived at the manor. He was a tall, silver-skinned man with eyes that were too large and too intelligent for a human. He dressed in a perfectly tailored London suit, but he moved with a fluid, predatory grace that set Clara's hardened instincts on edge. "Miss Penhaligon?" he asked, his voice a resonant, multitonal melody. "My name is Ambassador Vuar of the Catharian Collective. I was a friend of your uncle. In another life." Clara didn't flinch. She invited him in, her hand surreptitiously checking the small frequency disruptor she kept in her pocket. "My uncle had many friends, Ambassador, though few looked quite like you." Characters of this portion: 1,059 total characters. 26,992. Var smiled, a sad, shimmering expression. "I see Arthur succeeded. You are hardened. You are one of the Watchers. I have come because the Galactic Council is concerned. We felt the blue pulse 3 years ago. We felt the white light before that. You are using the sins, Miss Penhaligon, the forbidden technologies of the unification." Clara poured him tea, her movements precise. "We are protecting our home, Ambassador. The council chose neutrality when the wraiths came. We chose survival. Vuar looked at his tea, the steam reflecting in his large silver eyes. The council chose neutrality because they feared the Vorash. They did not realize that the Vorash were merely the children playing in the yard. They did not realize that humanity was the old man in the basement with a shotgun. But now they know. The galaxy is terrified of you, Clara. They see a species that can erase its own emotions to win a fight. They see a species that hides its fangs behind a cup of Earl Grey. Characters of this portion: 1,057 total characters. 28,049 terrified. Clara asked, her voice cold. Good. Perhaps that will keep them from our borders. Or shook his head. Fear leads to preemptive strikes, my dear. There are factions in the council, led by the Vorash remnants, who believe that humanity is a galactic infection that must be purged before you forget the concept of mercy entirely. They are building a fleet. A real fleet this time. Not just ships but suns eaters. They plan to turn your own sun into a black hole. Clara felt a chill, but she didn't let it show. She simply reached for a biscuit. Then they have made a grave mistake, she said. They think they are attacking a nation. They don't realize they are attacking a museum. And we haven't even opened the Grand Gallery yet. Vuar looked at her, his silver skin paling. The Grand Gallery? Arthur told me about it. I thought it was a myth. The Omega Protocol? Clara stood up, her gaunt frame suddenly echoing the terrifying authority of Lord Arthur. Characters of this portion: 1,027 total characters. 29,076. It is no myth, Ambassador. If the Council attacks our sun, they aren't just threatening England. They are threatening the concept of light itself. We have a weapon in the deep archive that doesn't just erase enemies. It erases the law of gravity in their home systems. It turns their stars into glass. We don't use it because it would destroy us too. But if our sun is gone, we have nothing left to lose. She walked to the window, looking out at the foggy Oxfordshire hills. Tell them to stay away. Tell them that the gentlemen of England would like to finish their tea in peace. But tell them that if they cross the line, we will make the entire galaxy a museum of forgotten stars. Vuar stood up, his multitonal voice trembling. I will tell them. But Clara, look at yourself. You are 25 years old, and you speak like a god of destruction. Is this what Arthur wanted? To save the world by turning his children into monsters? Clara didn't turn around. Arthur wanted us to have a mourning. He didn't say we had to be happy in it. Characters of this portion: 1,093 total characters. 30,169. Ambassador Vuar left Blackwood Manor that evening, his shimmering ship disappearing into the violet-tinged clouds of the stratosphere. Clara descended once more into the archive. She didn't go to the deterrence console. Instead, she went to a far corner of the vault, to a single small container that didn't hum or glow. It was labeled, The Last Resort. Source: The Concept of Hope. She sat on the cold floor, her head in her hands. She understood now why Arthur had been so frail, why his hands had trembled. He wasn't just old. He was carrying the weight of the void. He had sacrificed his own peace so she could grow up in a world of honesty, and then he had sacrificed that honesty to save her life. It was a cycle of sacred sins. She realized that being a human, in the eyes of the galaxy, was a terrifying thing. To the aliens, humans were killers who chose to be better. But to Clara, humans were protectors who chose to be worse. They were the only ones willing to become the monsters to keep the monsters at bay. Characters of this portion: 1,061 total characters. 31,230. A few months later, the Sun Eaters arrived at the edge of the solar system. The Galactic Council's fleet was massive, thousands of ships, each one a masterpiece of alien engineering. They didn't send an ambassador. They didn't issue a demand. They simply began to deploy the singularity seeds around the sun. On Earth, the scientists at Greenwich were baffled. The sun was flickering, losing its mass. The temperature in London began to drop. Frost covered the rose gardens of Oxfordshire in mid-July. Clara stood in the deep archive, her team on the comms. Thomas was in Whitehall, George in Dover. Is everyone ready? She asked. Her voice was as steady as a surgeon's. Ready, Thomas replied. The Whitehall anchor is primed. Dover is ready, George said. We have the gravity shear on standby. Clara looked at the Omega Protocol terminal. She didn't want to do it. If she pulled this trigger, the concept of hope would be burned as fuel. Humanity would survive, but they would never again be able to believe in a better future. They would become a species of cold, purely logical survivors devoid of dreams. Characters of this portion: 1,085 total characters, 32,315. But then, she saw something on the monitors. It wasn't an alien ship. It was a message broadcast on a frequency only the archive could receive. It was from Vjor. Clara, stop. Look at the Vorash flagship. They aren't firing. She adjusted the sensors. The Vorash fleet was fighting itself. A civil war had erupted in the middle of the Council's armada. The Catharians and a dozen other species had turned their guns on the Sun-Eaters. What's happening? George asked over the comms. The game of shadows, Clara whispered, a tear finally rolling down her cheek. Vjor told them. He told them what we were. He didn't just tell them about our weapons. He told them about our choice. He showed them that we chose to be peaceful, and that we chose to hurt ourselves to save them from the wraiths. The alien fleet was in chaos. The singularity seeds were being destroyed by the very species that had brought them. The realization that humanity was a hidden predator hadn't led to an invasion. It had led to a reformation. Characters qua portion: 1,019 total characters, 33,334. The Council realized that if humanity was willing to sacrifice its own trust and its own mercy to protect the galaxy, then humanity wasn't a threat, it was a guardian. The Sun-Eaters were dismantled. The Council fleet withdrew, leaving behind a single diplomatic probe. The message was simple. To the people of England and the curators of the deep, we choose the morning too. Let us finish our tea in peace. The frost melted from the roses in Blackwood. The sun returned to its full golden glory. Clara sat at the console, her hand shaking as she deactivated the Omega Protocol. She hadn't had to burn hope. We did it, Thomas said, his voice cracking with relief. We didn't have to open the gallery. Clara didn't answer for a long time. She looked at the terminal, then at the small container of hope. No, she said finally. We didn't. But we are still the Watchers. The galaxy knows our name now. They know we are the killers who chose to be better. And they know we are always watching. Characters qua portion: 1,048 total characters, 34,382. Blackwood Manor remained a place of quiet study and ancient manuscripts. Clara Penhaligon lived there for the rest of her long life. A respected historian and a beloved member of the community. To the villagers, she was just Miss Clara, the lady who looked after the old house and hosted the best tea parties in the county. They never wondered why she always wore a lead-lined headset when the wireless acted up, or why she spent so many nights in the cellar. The deterrents remained. The museums of forgotten sins stayed locked. But the world was different. There was a new kind of balance. Humanity was no longer the baby of the galactic family. They were the elders who lived at the end of the lane, the ones everyone was polite to, and the ones no one dared to cross. And every year on the anniversary of the Great Silence, Clara would sit in the garden with Thomas and George, now old men themselves. They would drink their tea, look up at the clear blue English sky, and remember the white light, the blue pulse, and the old man who had taught them that the most dangerous weapon of all is the choice to be kind. Characters qua portion: 1,098 total characters, 35,480. As the decades drifted by, the Legends of the Deep Archive became just that, legends. To the galactic community, the Terran Guard was a mythic force, a spectral presence that ensured the safety of the trade routes without ever firing a shot. The deterrents had become a psychological reality. No empire dared to rise too high, for fear of the executioners of Oxford. But inside the archive, the work never stopped. Clara trained a new generation of curators, young men and women from across the UK, who had shown a natural aptitude for the game of shadows. She taught them the ethics of the void and the grammar of erasure. She made them read Lord Arthur's journals until they understood that their power was a curse, not a gift. You are the secret keepers, she told them, Her voice aged but still possessing that terrifying Penhaligon authority. You are the ones who must stay in the basement so the world can live in the sun. You must never seek glory. You must never seek thanks. Your only reward is the silence of the night. Characters qua portion. 1,057 total characters. 36,537 One evening, a young apprentice named Alara, a girl with the same piercing gray eyes as Arthur, asked a question that had haunted Clara for years. Mistress Clara, if we keep erasing our sins and our emotions to win, won't we eventually become the very things we are fighting? Won't we become ether wraiths ourselves, predators with no concept of time or heart? Clara looked at the girl, seeing the hardening already beginning in her young face. She took Alara's hand, her own skin as thin as parchment. That is the greatest sin of all, my dear. And it is the one we must fight every single day. That is why we have the tea. That is why we have the garden. We must surround ourselves with the very things we are protecting. We must love the world so fiercely that the thought of losing it is more terrifying than the thought of the archive. If you ever stop loving the smell of the rain or the sound of a cricket match, then you must resign. A curator without a heart is just another monster. Characters qua portion. 1,034 total characters. 37,571 Clara lived to be 97. On her final day, she sat in the library of Blackwood, the same chair Arthur had occupied so many years ago. The fire was roaring, and the scent of Earl Grey filled the room. The sky was a perfect, deep twilight blue, the first stars of the evening beginning to twinkle over the hills. Alara stood by her side, holding the tray of biscuits. "It's a lovely evening, mistress," Alara whispered. Clara smiled, her eyes dimming but her spirit still sharp. "It is, Alara. A very lovely morning." She looked at the bookcase, at the volume of Paradise Lost that held the key to the dark. She knew that the Blackwood deterrence would continue. She knew that humanity would always be the hidden predator, the killers who chose the light. But she also knew that the light was winning, not because they had better weapons, but because they had something the galaxy had never seen before. A species that was willing to break its own heart to keep the peace. She closed her eyes, the sound of the grandfather clock ticking away the seconds of a long, peaceful, and beautifully silent life. Characters qua portion. 1,085 total characters. 38,656 The clock struck 12, and the manor was still. In the village of Blackwood, the people slept in their beds, unaware that their capacity for mercy, and their love of music, had once been on the brink of erasure. They woke the next morning to the sound of birdsong and the smell of damp grass, complaining about the British weather as they always did. The executioner was dead, but the history remained. Alara descended into the archive, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She sat at the console, her fingers poised over the keys. She opened the final page of Clara's journal and saw a single hand-drawn image. A simple cup of tea with a tiny hidden wolf's head in the reflection of the liquid. Beneath it, Clara had written, "The choice is yours. Make it a kind one." Alara breathed in the scent of ozone and ancient secrets. She felt the weight of the deep archive, settling onto her shoulders, a burden of iron and titanium. She looked at the monitors at the vast, dangerous galaxy beyond the fog. "Anchor Blackwood active," she whispered. "Curator Alara, we are ready." And outside, the sun rose over England, golden and warm, casting long shadows that held no fear. Characters qua portion. 1,126 total characters. 39,782 The galaxy continued its slow, indifferent spin, but for those who knew where to look, the 7 anchors of Terra were a constant, reassuring pulse in the dark. The hidden predator had become the silent arbiter, a species that didn't rule, but merely kept the time. The ether wraiths never returned. The hive minds sought easier prey. And the sun-eaters became a cautionary tale told to alien children. Humanity remained a mystery, a species of polite, tweed-wearing historians who lived on a small, foggy island and possessed the power to unmake the universe. They were the ones who had mastered the art of the deterrence, the ones who knew that the greatest victory is the war that never happens. And in the heart of Oxfordshire, at the end of a long winding lane, Blackwood Manor stood as it always had, a monument to the forgotten sins and the endless mourning. The great silence was total, and in that silence, humanity finally found its peace. Not the piece of the week, but the piece of the gentleman who knows exactly where his shotgun is hidden, and chooses every single day to leave it in the cellar. Characters qua portion: 1,091 total characters. 40,873 with circumflex u twin sang to with tilde han thun.